Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 14 running back rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're going to be covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses thus far this season, on average, have been giving up the most points to opposing running backs between Week 7 through 13, in order to give ourselves a little bit more perspective as to which of these running backs we must play based on matchups. And of course, which of these running backs we might want to avoid because defenses aren't really giving up too many points to them on the ground. Now, after we cover that topic, we'll then transition into talking about our top 36 running back rankings for the given week, as I'll share with you guys my opinions and the statistics that justify the reasons as to why I have them ranked as such going into the week. Before we begin, again, I want to remind you guys, even though I have the rankings as such, top 18 on the screen, and then we transition to number 19 through 36, you got to remember that rankings are always subject to change. Over the course of a week, whether it's the singular running back themselves dealing with injuries or other running backs in their backfield that may be out, which may give them more opportunity, it's going to adjust the variables that I take into account when ranking players. Even players like offensive linemen or defensive linemen that are key players that may be missing in said matchups will definitely adjust the rankings over the course of the week. That's why you have to stay up to date on my latest content and subscribe today, whether it is the Wednesday wide receiver rankings, quarterback and tight end rankings as we do throughout the week, must start players, Saturday live stream, Sunday morning live stream from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, all for the purpose of helping you set your lineups, answer starter sit questions, and of course, help you get into those playoffs. We're 1 week away. For many of you, we're in a win to get in situation. And if we can go ahead and accomplish that and get you into the big dance, all you have to do is put together a streak of games and you could become a 2022 fantasy football champion. And of course, have the bragging rights, win your league prizes, all that kind of jazz. So that's the entire purpose of this channel, and that's what we're going to try to accomplish. Before we begin, another thing I want to remind you guys of, if you guys have not yet already and you want to continue to play fantasy football at a daily basis, again, be sure to check out PrizePicks. This week, they have a current free square of Justin Herbert, 0.5 passing yards. It is an automatic. Again, when we talk about potential PrizePick entries on a given weekly basis, it's just outside of our leagues. Yes, I have myself 13 leagues that I play in, but I still put together entries for PrizePicks because it's fun. I get to have more skin in the game. Even in last night's contest, putting together an entry with Chris Godwin and Tom Brady, and I also had an NBA player attached to it. Ended up going well because of the buzzer beater touchdown that Tom Brady threw at the end there. But again, if you want to go ahead, put together some entries via PrizePicks, include Justin Herbert in it, picking more or less on given player statistic. This will be an absolute perfect opportunity to do so. Use promo code Andrew when you sign up today, because when you make that first time deposit, when using promo code Andrew, your first time deposit is immediately doubled up to $100. So whether it's a base minimum $10 deposit that gives you an additional 10 or a $50 deposit that gives you an additional 50, that's up to you. Check that out today and put together some entries. So have some fun via PrizePicks. There's a link down in the description. Thank you very much. All right. Let's begin talking about Week 14 running backs, beginning with matchups. As you can see to the right side of the screen, we have how many points defenses have allowed to opposing running backs in all statistical categories, whether that's rushing yards, rushing touchdowns, receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns, all for a per game average over the course of the last 6 to 7 weeks. Of course, week 7 through 13. Some of these teams have had bye weeks, but we've already taken that into account statistically. Over the course of this streak of games, the Seattle Seahawks have been giving up the most points, followed by the Las Vegas Raiders, Chicago Bears. But like I've mentioned to you guys in the past, over the last 2 to 3 years, I have been putting together statistics that continue to emphasize the idea that receiving statistics cannot be taken into account when we're talking about matchups. Whether it is, a fantastic matchup, like for example, we have the Las Vegas Raiders, who have given up 48 receptions and 426 receiving yards over the course of just the last couple weeks here to opposing running backs. That's fantastic, but it does not mean a running back is going to get an influx of receptions because of the matchup, because primarily the reason whether or not a running back gets opportunities is whether their team is more willing to go ahead and target the running back position and get them involved in that sort of scheme. That being said, when we go ahead and isolate just rushing statistics alone to purely determine how effective a matchup can be within a given week, we found that the Houston Texans, Los Angeles Chargers, New York Giants, Chicago Bears are at the top of the list. Again, a lot of these teams have been giving up a boatload of points to opposing running backs, and we absolutely need to be taking advantage of that going into this week. Of course, the Cowboys running backs, specifically the thumbnail for today's episode, Ezekiel Elliott takes on the Houston Texans, the easiest matchup of the position. We have guys like Raheem Mostert and Jeff Wilson Jr. who take on the Los Angeles Chargers. We have Miles Sanders taking on the New York Giants. Maybe even Kenneth Gainwell can get himself some value in this given week. Either way, we'll be referring to these statistics as we progress throughout today's video in regards to how advantageous a matchup can be and On the other end of the spectrum, how difficult some of these matchups are, especially going up against Tennessee. Travis Etienne's going to have his hands full. And of course, going up against San Francisco, Leonard Fournette, Rachaad White, good luck this weekend, gentlemen. You're going to have your hands full as well, considering the running game pretty much doesn't exist when you're taking on the San Francisco 49ers. Based on the fantasy points that we can see on screen, only 6.67 rushing statistic fantasy points allowed on a per week basis over the course of week 7 through 13. Okay, now that we've covered that, let's go ahead and transition and begin our top 36 running back rankings for the week. Beginning with our number 1, we have Christian McCaffrey. He was the number 1 overall running back in week 13, but that's not why I have him at this top of the conversation. I believe that Christian McCaffrey is going to continue to garner a lot of receiving work, and of course, this team is going to lean upon the running game due to the absence of Jimmy Garoppolo. With Brock Purdy, Mr. Irrelevant at the quarterback position, we purely expect a lot of opportunity to go in the direction of Christian McCaffrey because that's exactly what we witnessed as soon as Brock Purdy came into the game. Christian McCaffrey with Purdy had 9 targets, 7 catches, 47 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. And even though earlier in that drive for the receiving touchdown, he dropped the touchdown, Purdy went right back to him. They scored and they connected. And that continues to build confidence in my mind that this offense is going to run through McCaffrey because it has to. Whether it is more rushing attempts because of the absence of an Elijah Mitchell, or whether it's more opportunity because they have to keep the ball out of this young quarterback's hands in order to stay in matchups, I absolutely expect to see a lot of opportunity go in the Christian McCaffrey's direction. He had 17 rushing attempts on Sunday. That's the most rushing attempts he has had since that Los Angeles Rams game in week 8. And as his opportunity continues to increase, I expect his fantasy points to follow in this offense that is so desperate to continue to win games. Christian McCaffrey is going to be the key to their potential success for the future. Let's move on to our number 2. We have Josh Jacobs. Again, Josh Jacobs has been incredible. Over the course of the last 3 weeks now, I think actually it's 4 consecutive games of more than 17.5 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. An incredible streak of games that he is continuing to put together. 26 attempts for 144 rushing yards and a touchdown on Sunday for 20 fantasy points. Obviously got a little bit of a sprinkle in the receiving game, while many of us weren't 100% certain as to whether or not he was going to play. Again, he continues to be on the injury report, and if you are worried about that, be sure to pick up Zamir White because that is his immediate handcuff in a rushing sense. But he's a tough son of a gun. He's going to continue to play on a weekly basis and fight through these injuries. Again, if this team wants to continue to win and try to make a playoff run here, they have to continue to get Josh Jacobs utilized. In his career since 2020, the Las Vegas Raiders are 13-1 in terms of a win-to-loss record when Josh Jacobs has more than 80 rushing yards in a singular game. I'm expecting this team to continue to go back to him. Of course, he's still dealing with a quad and calf injury. But again, Zamir White would be the pickup to make sure you cover all your bases because you got to remember they do play on Thursday night against Los Angeles Rams. It should be an exciting matchup between these two teams. Moving on, let's talk about Derrick Henry, our number 3. Derrick Henry's been very quiet over the course of the last 2 games. And that is a given. The Cincinnati Bengals and the Philadelphia Eagles have completely shut him down. 11 carries for 30 rushing yards on Sunday. Seems like Austin Ekeler rushing statistics. That doesn't look like Derrick Henry numbers. But based on the fact that we haven't seen him have an explosive performance in quite some time, I think we're about to see a huge streak of games where he goes against Jacksonville this week, the Chargers the following week, and then Houston the next week after that. We could very easily see Derrick Henry take over in the next 3 weeks, which I'm purely expecting that to begin with his Jacksonville Jaguars matchup. In the last 2 games that he has played against the Jacksonville Jaguars in his career, he has put up 31.0 and 35.2 fantasy points. In both those games, each put up 130 plus rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns minimum. I think this is a fantastic matchup, especially considering the fact that we just saw Detroit Lions running backs go for over 100 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns against this defense. We've seen a lot of running backs succeed against the Jacksonville Jaguars this season already, and I think Derrick Henry is just going to be another one of them. Moving on to Austin Ekeler, our number 4. Austin Ekeler, again, very underwhelming performance, mainly because he fumbled a ball that could have led to a touchdown drive, and he also didn't score a touchdown. Whenever Austin Ekeler doesn't score a touchdown, of course, we're going to sit in that 10, 11, 12 point range in a half PPR scoring format. And then his upside is going to be deemed whether or not he finds the end zone. Going forward, especially going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Miami Dolphins, I do expect this to be a little bit of a better overall week because they were missing 3 starting offensive linemen on Sunday. Their center and they're both their right and left tackle. So if in fact we get a little bit more of those starting depth back, especially Corey Linsley on the inside playing that center role, one of the best in the league, will absolutely allow them to run the ball more effectively. But either way, if we get those offensive linemen back, we can get the running game a little bit more utilized in that capacity. The receiving game is always going to be there. And when it is, Austin Ekeler always will have upside. I mean, we just saw Christian McCaffrey be the number 1 overall running back within the week going up against Miami because of his receiving contributions. Obviously, Austin Ekeler will be able to follow suit. Moving on to Nick Chubb, our number 5. Okay, so here's the thing about Nick Chubb. They take on the Cincinnati Bengals. And the last 3 games that he has taken on the Cincinnati Bengals, okay, in which he has been a full healthy participant and hasn't left the game early, he has put up 24.9, 29.3, and 25.8 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. So a minimum of 24 fantasy points in each of those 3 contests. And he's been able to put up a minimum of 100 plus rushing yards and 2 touchdowns in each of those games. One of them being earlier this season in week 8, in which they dominated against that Cincinnati Bengals defense. Now, not only have we seen that level of dominance, we've also seen the Cleveland Browns win 5 straight games against the Cincinnati Bengals. And to be totally honest, the Cincinnati Bengals, even though they shut down Derrick Henry a couple weeks back, they were getting torched on the ground by the Kansas City Chiefs and the efforts of Isiah Pacheco and, of course, Jerick McKinnon. So if we're going to be in a situation here where Nick Chubb is going to be asked to dominate the game and, of course, dictate the game because Deshaun Watson is still in that learning process coming off of a week where he was 12 for 22 passing against the Houston secondary, I'm expecting Nick Chubb to be able to dictate this game. And of course, have the offense run through him, because if they're not able to, it's going to be a very difficult week for them to go ahead and find success against such a high scoring offense where they're going to have to keep up with. I think, Nick Chubb, obviously, behind this offensive line, has a great chance of putting together a great performance. Hopefully, that Houston game is behind us, and we're not going to see another performance like that where he's not able to score a touchdown and bring us fantasy success within the given week. Moving on, let's talk about our number 6, Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard takes on the Houston Texans. Now, even though Nick Chubb wasn't able to take care of this advantage that he had last week against the matchup, Tony Pollard should absolutely be able to do so. In 2 out of the last 3 weeks, Tony Pollard has put up 23 or more fantasy points, and those have mainly been in blowout scenarios. One against the Minnesota Vikings where he scored 2 touchdowns, and then the other on Sunday night, of course, against the Indianapolis Colts. It was a blowout scenario late in that game. He scored 2 touchdowns. So if we're going to continue to see Tony Pollard get a high volume of opportunity, and this is going to be a blowout contest, of course, we expect him to run the ball and, of course, blast through this defense and find himself in the end zone. Tony Pollard, an automatic play going into the given week based on his opportunity, his upside, his home run hitting ability, and the Houston Texans cannot stop a soul in the running game, quite frankly. Moving on, let's talk about our number 7. The other end of this Dallas Cowboys conversation, Ezekiel Elliott, the thumbnail for today's video. Ezekiel Elliott has had himself 5 consecutive games of 15 or more fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. Not only that, in those last 5 games that he has played, he has scored 7 total touchdowns. The level of opportunity they continue to send in the direction of Ezekiel Elliott is unbelievable. Coming off of a game in which he had 20 total touches, 3 through the air on 3 targets, and 17 on the ground. Hyper efficient in his rushing opportunities over the course of the last 2 weeks. And this is all while Tony Pollard in the last 3 weeks has had 21, 20, and 14 touches. If you continue to have a 2-headed monster at this capacity going up against the Houston Texans of all defenses, it's an automatic success. Both these guys are must-starts in the given week. Moving on to Miles Sanders, our number 8. He takes on the New York Giants, and like I've mentioned in the past, and specifically showing you guys the statistics in terms of how many points they've allowed to opposing running backs on the ground over the course of the last couple weeks, Miles Sanders is in a perfect position. Of course, the New York Giants have given up just this last week to Washington running backs 137 rushing yards, to Dallas running backs 152 rushing yards, Detroit running backs 150. They have given up their fair share of statistics on the ground. And of course, when we're talking about Miles Sanders, who takes advantage of these easier matchups, obviously he's coming off a week where he barely scored 10 fantasy points against a very difficult matchup against Tennessee. Even though he was behind one of the best, if not the best offensive line in the National Football League, it was still a difficult matchup. But going into this week against the New York Giants, this should purely be free fantasy points. Again, we're just a couple weeks out from Week 12's performance where Miles Sanders went for 29.5 fantasy points against the Green Bay Packers defense. I'm expecting not as high of a potential upside unless he, of course, finds the end zone multiple times. But at this current stage, I think he's going to be very easily in that top 10 conversation. That's why I have him at number 8. Moving on, let's talk about Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon has had a couple weeks off here, of course, wasn't able to clear concussion protocol. Now, with the last 2 weeks that he's missed, Samaje Perine has taken over. In fact, in the last 3 weeks alone, Samaje Perine is the number 2 overall running back in fantasy. Just putting that in perspective, it is a ridiculous statistic, but it is the fact of the matter. Samaje Perine behind this offensive line in Cincinnati, who has significantly improved over the course of the last 2 weeks. When I'm going back and I'm watching these games, they are actually dominating up front in the running game, and that continues to exploit a lot of these defenses, especially in the AFC, taking on the Kansas City Chiefs, of course, taking on the Tennessee Titans as of late, where they've been able to find success against both of those teams. As a whole, I do expect Samaje Perine to be utilized more and more as the season progresses because of how effective he has been over the course of the last 3 weeks. That being said, if Joe Mixon is back, and he should be, clearing concussion protocol, he should absolutely be the RB1 of this team and should have himself fantastic fantasy success against the Cleveland Browns, who just gave up their fair share of yardage to Dameon Pierce. if in fact this Cleveland Browns offense is not able to function at a higher capacity, similar to the way that they have in seasons past against the Cincinnati Bengals, we're going to be in a situation where the running game obviously stays intact and Joe Mixon is able to put up a great performance in his return. Moving on to Saquon Barkley. Now, speaking of some difficult matchups, Saquon Barkley has dominated difficult matchups over the course of the last 2 weeks. He's taken on division rivals like the Dallas Cowboys and the Washington Commanders, and even with offensive line injuries that have really hurt this team, he's been able to put up double-digit fantasy points in both those contests. And that is incredible to see. Going into this week, it's another one of these division rivals. Taking on Philadelphia, they just shut down Derrick Henry, and by all means, it should be considered a difficult matchup on hand. That being said, we're coming off of a week in which Saquon Barkley had the second most receptions of his season, 5 in this given week. And if he continues to get himself more and more utilization in the receiving game, and his offensive line continues to get healthy, and this offense, of course, is up for the task at hand, I expect to see another one of these great performances from Saquon Barkley because, quite frankly, the matchups don't matter. He's just far too talented to shut down. Moving on to Rhamondre Stevenson, our number 11. Rhamondre Stevenson's value has purely been dictated on his receiving statistics. Again, in the last 6 games, averaging 7.7 targets, 6.5 receptions, 49.5 receiving yards, and has scored 1 receiving touchdown throughout that span of time. Overall, he's getting himself in a half PPR scoring from about 7.5 fantasy points, even more actually, in fact, from just receiving statistics alone. We know he's going to be the primary running back of the team, even with the return of a Dameon Harris. We know he's going to be the continued goal line back. It's just a matter of whether or not they're going to be able to find success up against the Arizona Cardinals. They've given up their fair share of points to opposing running backs over the course of the last couple weeks, so I absolutely believe that Rhamondre Stevenson, tasked with the ability to go out there and dominate, coming off of a week in which he played 53 of the total 54 offensive snaps. He's literally not coming off the field. He is a huge part of this offense, and I absolutely believe that Rhamondre Stevenson will continue to find success in fantasy. Moving on to the final of our RB1 conversation, we close out with DeAndre Swift here. DeAndre Swift has given me a little bit more hope that he can maybe, just maybe, overthrow Jamaal Williams. Based on his performance of 14 carries for 62 yards, a rushing touchdown, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 49 yards, and the fact that they take on the Minnesota Vikings in this given week, I believe there is a lot of opportunity for this offense to go ahead and compete with the Minnesota Vikings and perhaps be put in a situation where the passing game will be called upon and DeAndre Swift will dominate the overall snap share and touches within the given game. In 3 out of the last 4 games, DeAndre Swift has scored a rushing touchdown. It should have been 4 out of the last 4 games, but again, in that Thursday game against the Buffalo Bills, his knee landed just short of the touchdown and obviously went down to the 1-yard line, and it eventually became somebody else's touchdown. But as a whole, I expect to continue to see this touchdown trend continue for DeAndre Swift in an advantageous matchup. Even though Jamaal Williams is going to be the primary goal line back, I truly do believe there is going to be a lot of potential upside here for DeAndre Swift coming off of a 100-yard total week to be able to put together another big performance here against a division rival in a must-win scenario. Moving on, speaking of a division rival, we have Dalvin Cook here, who of course will be taking on the Detroit Lions. And Dalvin Cook, he has found his recent success against the Detroit Lions. I mean, even earlier this season, he put up a pretty good amount of fantasy points, but in that same contest, Alexander Mattison scored a touchdown. They both combined for 24 carries, 124 rushing yards, and 2 touchdowns for 24.5 fantasy points. And that is eerily similar to what we just experienced from Dalvin Cook just this last weekend, where he was able to score a touchdown, but so was, of course, Alexander Mattison up against that New York Jets defense. Of course, he's going to siphon a couple touchdowns here and there, Alexander Mattison is, and I'm not too worried about it. As long as it's not on a consistent basis and it's once every three or 4 weeks, it is what it is. We can live with that. As long as Dalvin Cook is healthy, that's all that matters. But the fact of the matter is, the history of Dalvin Cook and Alexander Mattison against the Detroit Lions, it is, ridiculous. Alexander Mattison in his last 3 starts against the Detroit Lions, 22.8, 19.9, 28.0. Dalvin Cook's last 3 starts against the Detroit Lions, not including earlier this season, 38.2, 27.4, 14.5. They have had themselves incredible performances, but the fact of the matter is, as of this current moment in time, the Detroit Lions are one of the best defenses against the opposing running back position, and they have not allowed a singular starting running back with a rushing touchdown in the course of the last, 7 games here? Mostert, 64 rushing yards. Aaron Jones, 25. Montgomery, 37. Barkley, 22. Singletary, 72. Etienne, 54. None of them scored a touchdown, and the best performance has come from Devin Singletary of all running backs. Just putting that in perspective, it's going to be a tougher matchup this week. Hopefully, Dalvin Cook could find the end zone. Moving on to James Conner, number 14. Coming off of the bye week, James Conner is in a fantastic position, and I'm of the opinion that if you have the opportunity to perhaps trade for James Conner, it might be a good time to do so prior to the fantasy playoffs. Mainly because without Chase Edmonds and or Eno Benjamin over the course of the last 2 years, whenever we have had great opportunity in specific snap count increases for James Conner. His fantasy point upside has been ridiculous. In the 9 games that he has played this year and last year, where he has surpassed 65% of the offensive snaps, he is currently averaging 20.58 half PPR fantasy points per game. Already in the last 3 games that he has played without Eno Benjamin in the lineup, he's put up 22.1, 12.4, and 19.5. The opportunities are going up, and it's becoming a lot like last season where James Conner is taking over. Now, just this last week, the New England Patriots, they gave up their fair share of points to Buffalo Bills running backs. Both Devin Singletary and, of course, James Cook were able to find success. I'm expecting a great performance here from James Conner with his increases in overall snaps, his rushing attempts, his targets. They're continuing to rise, and his potential for, touchdown upside continues to follow, which is obviously key for a running back like James Conner. All right, moving on to our number 15, we have D'Onta Foreman. So here's the thing about D'Onta Foreman's potential for this week. He has obviously played extremely well over the course of the last 6 weeks. 4 of those games with over 100 rushing yards in them. So he's continuing to get opportunity, continuing to be the mainstay RB1 of this team. And now he has an opportunity going up against the Seattle Seahawks, who quite frankly could not stop the run against Cam Akers. Cam Akers, 60 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. Of course, the week prior to that, Josh Jacobs, 229 and 2 touchdowns. Of course, Rachaad White against that defense, 105 rushing yards, while Fournette in that same game, 57 rushing yards and a touchdown. Over the course of the last 3 games, the Seattle Seahawks have been exposed for not having a great run-stop defense. And if that's going to be the case against the team that primarily runs the ball, I'm expecting D'Onta Foreman to come out and absolutely ball out. I know he's currently dealing with a couple injuries, but he's had the bye week to go ahead, heal up, and be prepared for a fantastic performance in this great game. Moving on to number 16, Isiah Pacheco. Pacheco in the last 4 games here, just to put it in perspective, has been averaging 17 rushing attempts, 81 rushing yards, a half a rushing touchdown per game, and 11.8 half PPR fantasy points per game. Obviously getting himself a little bit more utilization in the receiving game, which is incredible to see, especially considering, again, he never really was expected to be a receiving back on this team when you had a guy like Jerick McKinnon, who has obviously dominated that workload over the course of the last month. But those numbers continuing to go up continue to allow me to play him in positions where you may not typically think he needs to be a starting option. But in comparison to his peers at the running back position, he's been a fantastic play over the last 4 weeks, consistently finding the end zone over the course of the last 2, which obviously makes him a double-digit play. Coming off of a week where he was 15.2 fantasy points against a pretty good defense in the Cincinnati Bengals, who shut down Derrick Henry just a couple weeks ago. Going up against the Denver Broncos this week, I expect Isiah Pacheco to be another one of these fantastic plays in a positive game script. When they mount a lead, they're going to continue to run the ball to kill the clock with Pacheco. Moving on to our number 17, we have Jeff Wilson Jr. Even though Jeff Wilson Jr. was quite literally 1 rushing attempt for 3 yards and 2 targets for 0 receptions and 0.3 half PPR fantasy points, I do expect him to get back on track. We have to put this in perspective. The offense was put into situations where they were not able to succeed. They were turning over the ball far too much. And with having Teron Armstead and, of course, their right tackle Austin Jackson out, this is a team in a running scheme in Miami that runs a lot of off tackle. And if they don't have those tackles ready to go, they're in a bad situation. They are going ahead and putting Austin Jackson on the injured reserve. Eric Fisher was signed earlier today to the organization, and they take on the Los Angeles Chargers this week, the second easiest matchup at the position. Of course, the recent matchup against this defense, of course, Las Vegas running backs, 154 rushing yards and a touchdown. Arizona, 125 against them on the ground. Kansas City, 140. San Francisco, 127 and a touchdown. Seattle, 202 and 2 touchdowns. In fact, we have seen incredible performances on the ground. I'm expecting Jeff Wilson Jr. to get back on track and, of course, run the ball at a heavy volume. Moving on to Jamaal Williams, number 18. Jamaal Williams is guaranteed a touchdown. He is guaranteed pretty much 10 fantasy points. Outside of that, I cannot guarantee you any more, especially with the current resurgence of what we have seen from DeAndre Swift. So at this current moment in time, I'm going to lean in the direction that, yes, Minnesota, they've given up their fair share of points on the ground. Of course, most recently, 100 rushing yards to the New York Jets, 52 to the New England Patriots. Of course, wasn't a great matchup, but 135 and 2 touchdowns to the Dallas Cowboys in that blowout matchup. So if we're in a situation where we're going to continue to see Jamaal Williams score touchdowns, which he will, he has scored a touchdown in 4 consecutive games and leads the running back position currently in the NFL with most rushing touchdowns. I'm expecting Jamaal Williams to find the end zone, be a 10-point play, and be a solid RB2 option in the given week. All right, moving on to the second half of the running back rankings conversation. Let's begin with Zonovan Knight. Now, this is under the assumption that Michael Carter does not return this week and potentially pose any threats to his overall baseline. But what Zonovan Knight was able to accomplish was 15 attempts and of course 90 rushing yards. He did have a singular attempt for over 40 rushing yards in that game, but he was very efficient in the opportunities he was given, because not only was he able to get it done on the ground, he had himself 5 targets, 5 receptions for 28 receiving yards, which is where I want to go with this conversation. In the 5 games in which Mike White has started for this team, he has produced an average of 14 targets to his running backs that have led to 11 receptions, 99 receiving yards, and 0.2 receiving touchdowns per game over that 5-game span with his running backs alone. Now, if in fact we're going to continue to see James Robinson and Ty Johnson be the only other running backs that are impeding on the potential success of Zonovan Knight, of course, both those guys combining for only 5 rushing attempts in Sunday's game against the Minnesota Vikings, I expect to see Zonovan Knight not only get all the goal line opportunities, which he literally was given on Sunday, had himself 3 red zone opportunities inside the 5-yard line. Unfortunately, was not able to find success. One of them fell 1 yard short, and the other got a negative 2-yard run, and the other stuffed for 0 yards. That's what led to, of course, Mike White having a QB sneak on the goal line, and of course, scoring a touchdown there. If Zonovan Knight puts together a touchdown, that's a 20-point performance within the given week. So as long as he's going to continue to maintain as the goal line back of this team, and of course, Mike White continues to target his running backs on a per-game average of 14 per game over the last 5 games that he's played for this organization, I'm expecting a lot of upside in this given week's matchup against the Buffalo Bills. Moving on to Travis Etienne. The primary issue that I have with Travis Etienne this week is the fact that he takes on the Tennessee Titans. Outside of that, I mean, he's coming off a week where he played 88% of the offensive snaps, had 13 rushing attempts, 54 rushing yards, 3 targets, 3 receptions, 12 receiving yards, was getting himself a lot of utilization. But again, when you take on the Tennessee Titans, a lot should not be expected in terms of fantasy points within the given week. Again, since week 7, the Tennessee Titans, in terms of rushing statistics allowed, are only giving up 6.76 per week. That is an unbelievably low number. They are only allowing 3.02 yards per carry on average since week 7. And over the course of the last 4 games, they've given up 55 rushing yards, 76 rushing yards, 53, and 57 as a total to entire backfields in itself. Unless Travis Etienne is to, potentially fall into the end zone with an advantageous position down the field, it's going to be difficult for me to automatically start him within the given matchup. Moving on, let's talk about our number 21. We have Seattle Seahawks running backs. Again, we don't know whether or not we're going to see a guy like Kenneth Walker play, or whether it's going to be DJ Dallas, or whether it's going to be, they just signed Wayne Gallman earlier today. Travis Homer is dealing with a knee sprain. There is a lot of conversations regarding this backfield, and this is one of those to be determined kind of situations. Of course, we want to go ahead, and if in fact we have waiver priorities, try to go after some of these running backs to accumulate them on your roster so that when we get to the Thursday, Friday practices, we have a better indication as to who is starting. But at this current moment in time, I am leaving it here. Whoever ends up being the starting running back for this organization, by the time we get to Sunday, I'm absolutely starting them at a top 21 capacity. That is why we just leave this here as Seattle running backs. Moving on to Devin Singletary, our number 22. Singletary is still going to be the primary goal line back. He's going to continue to get the bulk majority of touches, and I understand that he was out-touched, 13-20 on last Thursday's game against the New England Patriots. But again, I would be very surprised to continue to see James Cook continue to get that level of opportunity, especially with Nyheim Hines continuing to get his own opportunities. I'm expecting Devin Singletary to continue to be the primary back. Of course, they're going to sprinkle in more and more James Cook, but at this current moment in time, I'm very confident with the opportunities that he's being given, and he should be another one of these fantastic plays going into the week against the New York Jets, who just gave up a singular touchdown to both Alexander Mattison and, of course, Dalvin Cook, both finding themselves a lot of success in the matchup. Devin Singletary should follow suit. Moving on to Cam Akers, our number 23. It's a short week. They do play on Thursday against the Las Vegas Raiders, but you got to remember, the Las Vegas Raiders, they've given up their fair share of points to everybody. Their defense has been awful this season. In fact, Austin Ekeler was not able to score a touchdown. He broke a 5-game streak in which running backs scored touchdowns against the Las Vegas Raiders defense. I'm expecting Cam Akers and this matchup to potentially be closer because it's a short week, because everyone's beat up. They may be in a conversation here where they're able to compete, keep the game close because of their defense, and when they do so, give Cam Akers more and more opportunity in the running game. And when they do, hopefully find the end zone, similar to Sunday's performance against the Seattle Seahawks. Moving on, let's talk about Latavius Murray. Latavius Murray over the course of the last 3 weeks has been a fantastic fantasy option because of the opportunity volume. 21 touches, 14 touches, 21 touches. And even in this last weekend's game where Mike Boone was active and, of course, Marlon Mack was getting himself touches, Latavius Murray still had over 20 touches in the given game. Now, he takes on the Kansas City Chiefs, and if the game script gets out of hand, that could be brutal. But I do want to put this in perspective. Over the course of the last, I would say since week 6, the offense or the team as a whole for the Denver Broncos have scored 91 points. Their opposition has scored 124. They have kept a lot of these games close. If they're able to keep this game close and allow Latavius Murray to run the ball, at a higher capacity, we may be in a situation where absolutely Latavius Murray can be another one of these 8 to 10, even higher potential fantasy point contributors if he finds the end zone. Moving on, let's talk about Raheem Mostert, our number 25. So here's the thing about Raheem Mostert. Obviously, like I mentioned in regards to Jeff Wilson Jr., without two starting offensive tackles, they were going to struggle against San Francisco. They did exactly that. On top of that, they've gone ahead, they've signed a new offensive tackle, Eric Fisher. Teron Armstead should be returning as their left tackle. And if we're going to be in a position where they're healthy at the offensive line position, going into the second best matchup in the week, taking on the Los Angeles Chargers, we should see Raheem Mostert also be a relevant play. Mainly because Raheem Mostert not only out-snapped, but out-carried Jeff Wilson Jr., which may concern many of you, but in my mind, I think this is just, a par for the course based on the matchup that they took on Sunday. I'm expecting Raheem Mostert to be, potential high-end RB3 option. Moving on to Najee Harris, taking on the Baltimore Ravens. Listen, Najee Harris is a fantastic player. He played at a very high capacity, 17 carries for 86 rushing yards. Unfortunately, was not able to find the end zone. Would have been great for his overall week, but he takes on Baltimore this week. Over the course of the last couple games, the 5 most recent contests for running backs against Baltimore, they have totaled 43 rushing yards, 37 rushing yards, 24, 42, and 68. Baltimore is one of the best defenses in the league in terms of stopping the run, and against a division rival like the Pittsburgh Steelers, I'm expecting Najee Harris to have his hands full and for this offensive line to certainly struggle, which could potentially lead to Najee Harris not running the ball as much with less opportunity, less potential upside. And if that's going to be the case, and perhaps they are in a negative game script because Tyler Huntley's efforts, we could be in a tough situation here with Najee Harris in the given week. Moving on, let's talk about Leonard Fournette. Leonard Fournette seems like he's going to be the primary back. Like I mentioned on Sunday and, of course, yesterday during the live stream, we are in a situation where Leonard Fournette is pretty much the Ezekiel Elliott and Rachaad White is pretty much the Tony Pollard. Rachaad White doesn't have as much, opportunity and or touchdown home run upside. But either way, Leonard Fournette, as long as he maintains as a starter, will continue to have fantasy value. Unfortunately, this week they take on the San Francisco 49ers, who since week 7 have only allowed 6.67 fantasy points per game in rushing statistics alone, which is tough to believe considering, again, Leonard Fournette needs rushing upside to be relevant. Yes, he still got himself 6 receptions and 32 receiving yards on Sunday, but if he's only able to get himself receiving work and split that with Rachaad White against the San Francisco 49ers, he could be in a massive heap of trouble, which makes him perhaps an option that we may not want to start because of the matchup itself. Moving on to Dameon Pierce. Speaking of matchups, Dameon Pierce had himself a pretty good performance against the Cleveland Browns, putting up 11.1 fantasy points, but it mainly had to do with the fact that the Cleveland Browns were not taking over that game early. And because of that, it allowed Dameon Pierce to consistently stay in the game. Now, that could very easily happen once again against the Dallas Cowboys. I mean, quite frankly, he could score a touchdown on the first drive. I cannot definitively tell you that he is not going to. So he could be of value. But the fact of the matter is, I'm expecting the Dallas Cowboys to do to the Houston Texans what they've most recently done to the Minnesota Vikings and the Indianapolis Colts. Blow them out and, of course, force a negative game script upon the opposing offense, which will force them to stop running the ball. And in the case of Dameon Pierce, which will certainly hurt his overall baseline of fantasy production. Moving on to James Cook, our number 29. Again, he is an incredible potential talent here, but it's going to purely be a matter of how many opportunities he's given on a weekly basis. He's coming off a week where he had 14 rushing attempts and 6 receptions on 6 targets. That is a really high upside game. Due to the extremely positive game script aspect of that game on Thursday night against the New England Patriots, Mac Jones not able to consistently move the ball downfield, it led to more rushing attempts and bleeding of the clock from James Cook. I'm not 100% certain that is going to exist here with the New York Jets, but certainly could. I'm expecting him to get more and more of a role. But with Nyheim Hines getting more and more opportunities himself and Devin Singletary being the primary goal line back, I'm still expecting James Cook to be in that RB3 conversation. Moving on to Kareem Hunt. Speaking of the RB3 conversation, look, Kareem Hunt could very easily within a given week be an RB2, but he has to score a touchdown. He hasn't done that in quite some time, so we'll continue to leave him in this conversation. The only thing that I wanted to point out is that he's coming off a week where he had over 10 touches, first time in a while, and if we're going to continue to see that from him out of this backfield, of course, he's going to have fantasy value, especially going up against a difficult matchup like Cincinnati. Like I mentioned with Nick Chubb, in the last 5 games, the Cleveland Browns have beaten the Cincinnati Bengals. But in order to do so, they've had to score 35, 37, 41, 21, and 32 points. If you are going to expect high numbers like that with Watson under center, we're going to have to see a lot of utilization and not only upside from Nick Chubb, but of course Kareem Hunt in this given week. Moving on to Rachaad White. Okay, so here's the deal with Rachaad White. Like I was mentioning with Leonard Fournette is going to continue to be the primary running back. The fact that Rachaad White did fumble in that game, but was able to get himself that touchdown and that trust-building moment at the very end of that game was clutch. That being said, I'm expecting Rachaad White to be the primary receiving back at times, but not, entirely. When we're going ahead and seeing 7 targets go in the direction of Leonard Fournette and 8 targets go in the direction of Rachaad White, you're splitting that receiving potential similar to the way where Fournette was able to dominate last season as an RB1, where he had all of that overall workload. So when you split that, it obviously does impact these guys as a whole. It is the toughest run-stopping defense in the league. And even though I think there is potential for Rachaad White to be a upside play with a couple receptions here that could lead to a touchdown, I can't trust it wholeheartedly. That's why we have him as 31. Moving on to Jerick McKinnon. In a similar situation, Jerick McKinnon is going to get himself opportunities, but unless he scores a touchdown, it's very difficult to automatically start him. Considering the 6 bye weeks that we are dealing with, we're probably going to have to start Jerick McKinnon, who was honestly gashing the Cincinnati Bengals defense, but as of this current moment in time, going into this week, even in those opportunities where he was playing as the Wildcat quarterback and getting opportunities, getting himself utilization in the receiving game, scoring a touchdown, unless he scores a touchdown, he's a 6-7 point player in a half PPR. Moving on to Samaje Perine. Like I mentioned, I'm expecting Samaje Perine to get himself more utilization as we progress here. He's coming off of a week where he had 100 rushing yards, 6 catches for 49 yards. He's done this on a multiple week basis where he's scoring a lot of points via the receiving game. If he ends up becoming the third down receiving back of this team, similar to the way he was utilized in 2021 in order to reduce the amount of overall workload on Joe Mixon's shoulders, I'm expecting to see Samaje Perine be a valuable fantasy asset who, quite frankly, could even be given goal line opportunities and or red zone opportunities, whether it's on the ground or through the air. Moving on to Ty Johnson. Like I mentioned in regards to Zonovan Knight, Mike White, over the course of the last 5 games he has played as they started where he hasn't left early with an injury, he has been able to produce, and I quote, 14 targets per game, 11 receptions, 99 receiving yards, and 0.2 receiving touchdowns per game with his running backs on roster. If we're going to see Ty Johnson come off another game where he had 6 or more receptions in this contest, especially if they're in a negative game script and have to pass the ball 50 plus times again, Ty Johnson could certainly be of value and, quite frankly, could even find the end zone. Moving on to Kenneth Gainwell. When they're in those matchups where the Philadelphia Eagles are taking on a team who isn't great in terms of stopping the run, they're going to mount an early lead. Oftentimes, Kenneth Gainwell is able to find the end zone early, and he's able to siphon a touchdown from Jalen Hurts and or Miles Sanders. And if we're able to see that early in this contest, we could very easily see a 12, 13 point contribution from Kenneth Gainwell in a very sneaky matchup going up against the New York Giants, who, like we talked about with Miles Sanders, are not a great defense in terms of stopping the run and have been giving up over 140, 50 rushing yards over the course of the last 3 weeks to opposing running backs. Moving on to the final option, we have Chuba Hubbard. Again, Deontay Foreman is going to be the primary number 1, but we could end up seeing more opportunities in the direction of Chuba Hubbard than we anticipate. If that ends up being the case against Seattle, who again have given up their fair share of points to opposing running backs over the course of the last 3 weeks, whether it was to Tampa Bay running backs, whether it was to Josh Jacobs, or of course Cam Akers this last week, Chuba Hubbard could be a value. All right, that's going to cover it for me today. Thank you everybody for watching. Those are my top 36 running back rankings for week 14 of the 2022 fantasy football season. Tomorrow we'll talk about the wide receiver position. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel, click the like button down below, and comment down below which of these potential running backs that I perhaps not mentioned that should be in this conversation, and perhaps which of these running backs should be higher or lower on my given rankings. Let me know down in the comment section so we can start a dialogue in that regard. I'll be down there answering questions. Outside of that, thank you everybody for watching. Again, do not forget, besides your viewership, of course, commenting, liking the video, subscribing. Another way to support the channel is via PrizePicks. Again, if you guys want to play daily fantasy at your fingertips, be sure to check out PrizePicks. There's a link down in the description. We have Justin Herbert going into the week as a free square. All you got to do is pick more on 0.5 passing yards. Accompany that with other performances, picking more or less, whether that's the NBA, the NFL, much more going into this weekend. Check that out today. Use the link down in the description and use promo code Andrew, because when you make a first-time deposit, when using promo code Andrew, your first-time deposit is immediately doubled up to $100. Check that out today, and be sure to play daily fantasy via PrizePicks. Thank you very much. All right, that's going to cover it. And until next time, tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.